Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another shelf of many things, where I take a look at small press and indie tabletop role-playing games and accessories. Once more, I'm going to take a look at a Stella Gamma publishing game, but this one is different. It is not based on the Cepheus engine or the Quantum engine, but rather is an OSR-style product using not the OGL, but the 5.1 SRD recently, as of this recording, placed into Creative Commons. Yes, I'm taking a look at Gargoyle 74, which the publisher was kind enough to send me a review copy of. Gargoyle 74 is, as I mentioned, an OSR system. It is one that is inspired by, and it appears somewhat compatible with, the old D&D 0th edition, also known as the White Box Original or Brown Box Edition from 1974. Thus the name. However, it is not a direct retro clone. It is very similar, but it does have some tweaks and modern stylings built into it while being numerically and functionally relatively compatible. It takes inspiration from sword and sorcery literature rather than having a Tolkien-esque basis as well, and the creatures and optional non-human races within it reflect that. As always, I will take a look at the presentation of the book, do a quick run-through of its contents, and then wrap up with my evaluation at the end. But before we get into it, I'd like to take a moment to thank this channel's sponsor,
World Anvil is a set of world-building tools for gamers and authors, featuring templates for articles on characters, locations, and legends, the ability to make interactive maps and timelines with the Chronicles system, organizational charts, and even random tables. It comes out of the box with support for over 45 role-playing systems, with homebrew support and more to make it easy to organize, track, and share lore between players and GMs. And all of the same techniques used to flesh out a world for gaming can be used by authors and other creatives who can build out their plots and story events and even monetize their world by offering exclusive access to sections of the lore, articles, and the stories that they write. World Anvil has a few pricing tiers suited for different needs, and right now you can get 40% off of any yearly subscription by using the coupon code RPGCrawler when you sign up with my link.
And with that, let's take a look at Gargoyle 74. Written by Tamir Levi and Omer Golan Joel, Gargoyle 74 is available in both PDF and print versions. Physically, the book is an easy-to-carry size with a limited color cover and a black and white interior with single-column arrangement, interspersed with tables and inline black and white line art where appropriate. Individual sections are set nicely aside, and the entire thing clocks in at about 114 pages. The actual writing style is clear and to the point. The overall arrangement easy to navigate and understand, but the usual spot-on copy editing I've grown used to with Stella Gamma Publishings has unfortunately fallen short in this release. There were many typos in the version that I reviewed, and while individually they didn't make the text particularly difficult to read, they were common enough to be very noticeable. Fortunately, being an online format does mean that these can be corrected in the future. Still, I would recommend a very careful and low-level copy editing sweep if some time, allows. Aside from that, the presentation is actually quite nice, with an adequate amount of line art of various styles to flesh out the look and feel, nicely formatted tabling, and concise descriptions and things like monsters and spell entries. As far as the contents themselves go, there is an introduction and then about 13 chapters divided amongst 3 main sections, with a set of 3 main appendices to flesh out additional material. After the introduction, there's Part 1, which is the player-facing rules, with Chapter 1 discussing ability scores, Chapter 2 listing and detailing the classes, Chapter 3 explaining equipment, Chapter 4 covers the general game rules, while Chapter 5 covers combat. There is an additional section of optional rules that details one-on-one play as well. Part 2 covers the magic system. It has a section on creating magical items and then a section on general spellcasting. The next 2 sections cover the cleric and mage spells, respectively. The third part of the book covers monsters and starts with a section on how to use them, then a section on reading their stats and dealing with their special characteristics. This monsters part wraps up with the longest section and actual bestiary of the monsters in the core system. The book concludes with 3 appendices. Appendix A offers some optional non-human races, since the default rules presume the characters are human. Appendix B offers guidance on creating treasures, while Appendix C offers a set of tables for random inspiration on dungeon contents and adventure plots. in more detail. The introduction starts with a brief overview of what Gargoyle 74 is, its inspirations from the customizability and ease of play of the original white box rule set, and its grounding in the pulp era, then goes over a bit about the authors, Tamir Levi and Omer Golan Joel, and I apologize for any mispronunciations there, as well as Stellagama Publishing in general. The first part of the book opens with a statement of Rule 0, that the referee may change any rule, and the existing rules are just guidance, before diving into an explanation of the abilities and character creation. Gargoyle 74 uses the classic 6 ability scores, except that Wisdom has been replaced/renamed to Intuition, which is very apt for the system in general. So Strength, Intelligence, Intuition, Dexterity, Constitution, and Charisma. There's the standard 3d6 in order for the main ability score generation, and bonuses follow the truly old school of -1 to +1 spread, so they can be relatively minimal on impact. Each ability score is then defined in turn. The chapter on classes then begins, but it starts with a quick rundown of terminology, which if you've played any OSR or D&D based game in the last several decades, or last 3 or 4 at least, considering there's only been like about, 4? Getting on 5 now? Anyway, I digress. If you're familiar at all with any form of D&D, you're probably familiar with these terms. That'll go ahead and lead right into the classes. Each class is described in turn. There's a general description, a list of usable arms and armor, any special abilities they may have, and then appropriate tables, including hit dice, combat bonuses, and saving throws, with spell progression and other appropriate tables as necessary. Notably, Gargoyle 74 does use the ascending attack bonus rather than the old school THAC0, a single save number mechanic rather than different categories, and all classes use D6s as hit dice, just different numbers of them at different times. There are only 4 classes: the Cleric, who has the ability to use clerical spells and turn undead; the Fighter, who basically can use any weapon and any armor, but is also the only class that actually gets to apply the strength bonus to damage, and they can attack multiple times, at first against smaller creatures, while later on getting an additional attack every so often. And finally, there is the Mage. Actually, I shouldn't say finally. Next is the Mage. As usual, they can cast spells, but they can also create magic items, and they can automatically detect magical influence on the... Well, not automatically, but they can pretty much at will try to detect magical influences on a location or area on a roll of 1d6. So they can not necessarily devote an entire spell to that if they don't want to. Now, finally, there is the Rogue, which can backstab, but also engage in subterfuge, various acts of cunning, dexterity, and guile, basically rolled up into one particular roll. Notably, the default game assumes that all player characters are human, although there are a few non-human species in the appendices at the end of the book. The optional rule section follows the classes and basically covers aging. It's an aging rule that gives different bonuses and penalties at different times to different classes. Each class is affected in a different way, and this actually gives you the opportunity to play beginning characters who are not necessarily quite young, so you can actually decide to play like either a young or an adult. I don't think you can start as elderly. Yeah, you can't start as elderly, but I'll give you the option to play a little bit more experienced if you're a wizard or so forth. Chapter 3, Equipment, begins with a statement of how much beginning characters start with in gold coins, and then covers the encumbrance system. Gargoyle 74 uses a very simple abstract object-based limit on what a character can carry based on both strength and constitution. It could use some, fleshing out as to what counts as what, but it serves pretty well just as is. The equipment tables then follow with armor, adventuring gear, and then weapons listed by name and then cost. There is a brief description of a few pieces of equipment that have special rules behind them. The system uses ascending AC for armor, and weapons all deal 1d6 of damage, with two-handed weapons essentially picking the better of two 1d6 rolls. Henchmen are also touched on briefly here, with basic costs and notes on how a character's charisma affects their morale. Chapter 4 covers the general rules needed to play the game, starting with experience. Gargoyle 74 uses a unified experience table for all character classes with a level limit of 10. Time is then touched on with It basically kept along old school lines. Rounds are about a minute long and turns are about 10 rounds. There are guidelines for wilderness travel, with travel times listed for various terrain, as well as talks of weather, food, and water, falling damage, and then listening checks. Trap detection, sneaking, and swimming are also discussed, with each of these rules being given maybe a paragraph or two of detail. This does allow people other than thieves to do certain of these things, just some people are better at it than others. The next chapter covers combat. A general outline for the combat round is listed, with a basic surprise check followed by classic initiative, both using a d6. Like many old school systems, spells are declared at the start so as to give the opportunity to try to disrupt a caster's spells. But unlike most old school systems, a check is made to see if the caster takes damage, and they determine by the roll whether they lose the spell or not, which can allow them to maintain concentration and cast through even if they get hit. After actions are taken, the round cycles back to declaring spells, meaning that a single initiative order is maintained throughout the combat in a more modern style, although I believe you can actually readjust yourself within that order given a particular combat mechanic. The combat section includes an optional reaction table to determine NPC attitudes during an encounter before explaining the attack and damage rolls, which function similar to classic D20 stuff, except as mentioned, only fighters may use strength modifiers. Damage is, of course, all based off variations of a d6 roll. Armor class, as I also mentioned, is ascending. Critical hits do exist, which is kind of rare for a 0 edition thing. You have more generous healing mechanisms, not that much more generous, but a little bit more generous. After combat, you can use healing kits to regain a small number of hit points, and healing takes place over only 6-hour resting cycles, regaining potentially more hit points than a classic OSR system would indicate. Death occurs below 0 hit points, with 0 hit points exactly allowing for recovery. There's a rule for sundering gear after suffering critical hits, and the chapter wraps up with rules for morale checks, using improvised weapons, and then unarmed attacks. The optional rules for one-on-one play wrap up the player part of the rules and include a set of modifications for a single character to make them more durable for such play. This includes adjustments to hit points and damage, suggestions on using henchmen and pets, a way to survive by sacrificing hit dice, unique talents, and so forth. Now, it references something called momentum in this version, but it does not go into what momentum actually means anywhere in the book, so that may be a copy error from another system. The second part of the book covers magic and spells, and after restating the Rule 0 of changing any rule, goes into magical item creation. This is actually a bit more fleshed out than one might expect of most OSR games, with information on creating a laboratory and then costs and details of making various types of magic items. Mages and clerics must both be level 5 to make items, and it appears as though clerics have a much more limited range of what items they can create. Notably, however, the cost to create items in gold doesn't actually appear to be all that hefty compared with some systems, so they may be a little bit more apt to be made. Spellcasting rules follow, and it appears as though Gargoyle 74 does the classic Vancian style system, although there is guidance for casting through damage and maintaining concentration, as I mentioned earlier. Spell levels are designated by letter rather than number, with each power level of a spell for both mage and cleric having about half a dozen spells in the base rules. Each spell has a name, a duration, a range, and a brief description. Many are similar to standard OSR spells, although a few names have been changed. A few spells serve dual purposes or more general purposes than your classic OSR style spells, allowing for multiple spells to effectively be condensed into one entry. The power level of these spells is roughly on par with other 0th edition style systems in terms of utility. Both cleric and mages have 5 power levels worth of spells from A to E. The third main part of the book, Monsters, once more reiterates the Rule 0 idea before having a very general rundown on how to use monsters in your story, and then details on the monster stats. Some things can be extrapolated. Each monster has a combat bonus based on its hit dice. Each monster causes 1d6 damage unless otherwise noted, but then information on life energy drain on undead is given, which drains not only hit dice, but constitution and age as well, making undead particularly vicious. Saving throws are generally based on fighters for monsters, and there's information on treasure. Monsters in Gargoyle 74 don't have a hard and fast treasure category like you'd see in many other OSR products, so this is useful. Finally, as another bonus to undead, pretty much all undead have special ways to destroy them, otherwise they just rebuild themselves automatically. The monsters themselves are then detailed in a bestiary, with each monster having its AC, hit die, attack type, special rules, experience value, and morale rating in a table, followed by a brief description and special rules regarding any of their special attacks below. Overall, the list of monsters includes mostly your standard offerings for a D20 OSR based system, but there are some variations. Certain creatures have had their special abilities tweaked. Demons include some extra abilities automatically. Dragons have certain spell immunities and require magical weapons to even hit, etc., etc. Basically, the rarer and more magical monsters tend to be a little bit more effective than one might expect in an OSR style system, making them even more deadly. This wraps up the basic rules, and with those three parts you can run the entire game, but the appendices are also quite useful. Appendix A just starts off with the various non-human types. They can be played at the referee's option. These are all optional back here, of course. You've got antediluvians, dwarves, and lizardkin rather than your standard Tolkien races. Now, antediluvians do effectively fill the role of elves and other OSR systems, being a sort of spellcaster and fighter type, but they're more alien. They're kind of an ancient sort of progenitor species. Dwarves are considered to be the mechanical creations of the gods, and as such have special rules for healing and repair, while lizardkin are a classic lizard-style species that are particularly useful in hand-to-hand combat. Each of these is treated as a race as class kind of way, with its own hit dice and ability progression. Appendix B covers treasures, which are presented by size rather than a number of different categories. There are tables for how many coins and magic items might be in a treasure, along with some tables of potions, weapons, and other magic items, which are each briefly described. Most of these are incredibly similar to basic standard D20 based OSR systems, although there are a few variations to fill in some of the charts where other things have been removed. Finally, Appendix C has random tables to flesh out a dungeon and a plot. Now, these may be useful for helping to generate both a dungeon and an adventure on the fly, but they aren't a complete system in and of themselves, and really seem to be more suited for inspiration, as they should be. The book then finishes with a sample character sheet. Note that there's none of your usual OGL style legal information, since this is a non-OGL book, which will take some getting used to. So, Gargoyle 74. What do I think about it? In terms of presentation, it works well enough. My earlier criticisms over the copy editing aside. The look and feel of the book is pretty much standard for a compact OSR offering. It is very easy to navigate, with rules clearly presented and where you would expect them to be. I rarely had to spend more than a few seconds flipping through the pages to find exactly what I was looking for at any given moment. I feel like many of the typos and such can be fixed over time, and may well be by the time that you see this. The system itself is interesting in both the similarities and the differences with other OSR systems that I've had the pleasure of playing and examining over the years. On the surface, one can take a fair amount of material for early retro clones and use them with minimal conversion with Gargoyle 74. I could easily see running swords and wizardry style material directly with it, since the differences are mostly in terms of internal procedures. Gargoyle 74 does tend to be more forgiving than strictly a 0th edition or even BX style role-playing and retro clones. Spellcasters have a couple spells available at first level, and they have a chance of retaining their spells after being hit, for instance. Characters that survive a combat have a slightly better time of getting back up to speed, thus reducing downtime without going to the extreme measures of a more modern system, like 5th edition. Little adjustments like that do add up in the long run and make for a slightly more heroic bent while still being dangerous. Because at the same time, the changes in various monsters more than make up for the adjustments on the higher end. This effectively maintains a decent difficulty curve for creatures that really should be dangerous epic threats, all without just pumping up hit dice and turning them into damage sponges. This allows characters to show themselves as becoming powerful and heroic against common fodder creatures, animal bandits, that sort of thing, while keeping them humble against the more exotic monsters of myth. I like this dynamic, and I feel it's rooted in the sword and sorcery pulp genre. It's very interesting how just a few tweaks here and there can change the skew of an otherwise very familiar system. I feel like the initial release of Gargoyle 74 feels a little bit on the rushed side from production quality point of view, but this is a mechanically sound system presenting a non-OGL old-school system of play that can be used to run classic pulp, sword and sorcery style adventures using a largely familiar base, but with just enough tweaks to make it its own thing. Is it going to topple the OSR Titans? No. But for a quick pick-up and play little book that you can shove into your pocket and take to different meetups, it gets the job done, and in my opinion, it's a little bit more playable than, say, random zero edition retro clones while maintaining much of the same feel and speed. I actually can't wait to see if some of the expansions that come out for it may differentiate it even more. On that note, I'm going to wrap things up here. This has been the RPG Crawler with my look at Gargoyle 74. As always, I will put a link to where you can pick it up below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.
And if you are still watching, I would like to take the opportunity to thank my supporters, the top tiers of which are listed on the screen, without whose support I would not have been able to offer the variety of content that I have on this channel throughout the years. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to join them, you can support the channel. There are a variety of options to do so. I have a Patreon, a Subscribestar, as well as channel memberships enabled. If you are not in a position to contribute, simply leaving a like, a comment, or sharing my videos are all wonderful ways to help the channel grow without spending a dime, and are all greatly appreciated.